Hey yo, it's Guido coming at you with a tank review of the Polish Tier 3 10TP, a Tier 3 light tank on the new Polish line. On this particular review of the tank, we will go through the whole process, as opposed to the Tier 1 and Tier 2 where I made a kind of truncated review of the tanks. These are the tanks at about Tier 3 or 4 where people would really start playing and spending any time. So we'll have an overview, we'll talk about the tech tree considerations, look at the 3D modeling of the tank, look at a comparison between it and some of its peers. Take a look at my stats. I think I only played about 9 games in it. My setup, what I used, and then move on to a couple examples of gameplay to get you through the 10TP Tier 3 Polish light tank. Let's get started with the overview. Here she is, the 10TP, a Tier 3 light tank on the Polish line. And you'll see up here at the top left, if you look at the details on it, that it was a development of the Christie tank. Had trials that it passed in 38 to 39, but unfortunately there was only one prototype made and it was destroyed at the start of the war. But you can see this is more or less what it would have looked at. So it's another kind of paper tank, a design tank, one that didn't really see the light of day other than a prototype. Not too large, although it is long. Let's look over this way so the sun isn't glaring in our eyes. If you take a look at, say, the T127, which is a well-known clubber tank at Tier 3, a premium. It's a little bit bigger than that. The T29 is quite gigantic. Another gold tank right there. Let's take a look at maybe the AMX, the little tiny AMX, which is very thickly armored in comparison to the 10T, roughly the same size. So most of the tanks at Tier 3 are kind of small. A couple of them are quite large. Of course, there's the Gross Tractor, which is just a great big behemoth right there. Something like the TOG of Tier 3. Armor at this level is strange. Most of the tanks have very strange angles and all kinds of stuff hanging off of them. We'll take a look at the armor in a minute. It is slightly angled, but you're not going to find a whole lot of advantage even to the slight angle that this thing has right here. And that is your 10TP overview. We'll move on to tech tree considerations for this tank. Let's talk about the tech tree considerations because there's a couple things to remember here. If you remember my Tier 1 review, there's only 2 crew in the Tier 1, like a lot of Tier 1s, not very many people. Once you get to Tier 2, it's 4 crew all the way to Tier 10, and they occupy the same positions. The Pudel is a premium. It has 5 crew. It's got the radio operator. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But you can move your crew straight through here as far as positions go, but remember, it's light tanks moving to medium tanks, moving to heavy tanks. So you're going to have to change the class of tank training as well. If you're using gold for that, that's going to be pretty expensive. My recommendation is just use 80% crews all the way through to the 4, and then maybe if you want to move your Pudel crew, if you have one, into the 25 TP, or buy a gold crew, or buy an 80% crew in the 25 TP and start moving them along, because you'll spend a little bit of time at Tier 5 if you're Iron Manning this thing through from the beginning to the end. Several options there, but the good news is that they occupy the same positions in the tank, even as you have to change them from light to medium to heavy. Crew management is a big deal in this game, and there's a lot of ways to do it, but just realize that there's a couple of those little tricks in there. Now, here's an interesting thing. We're going to click on the number on the Tier 2 because it starts off with this 37mm Bofors, which actually is a decent gun on this tank and did okay at Tier 2. But you've got to go through the turret to a better gun to get to the 10TP. So by the time you get to the 10TP, you will have unlocked this 40mm, which really changes the quality of the Tier 2. It can use the Tier 2 gun, the 37mm right here, no problem, and it got me through the 3 battles or so. However, like a bad penny, this 37mm shows up again when you come back to the 10TP and you start over again with that bloody gun, which is completely and utterly inaccurate or unusable. It's inaccurate as well. Completely and utterly unusable for the Tier 3. But the other thing you'll notice is you've got to go through the 47mm to get to the 14 TP Tier 4. So by the time you unlock that Tier 4 gun, you're in good shape. Also notice, and I've left it like this on purpose for you, I did not need to unlock the tracks or the engine or the radio to get the gun. Obviously, engine, radio wouldn't matter, but I did not need the tracks to put that gun on, so I ignored these upgrades and I went ahead and went straight through to the 14 TP. If you have a burning desire to upgrade everything on your Tier 3 and make it elite, by all means go ahead, but you'll notice that the requirements and experience are very low, and you should be able to do that in a couple battles. Like I said, this did not take me very long to get through. We'll go through my results and how long it took in just a moment. I want to warn you about one thing, and we'll talk about it pretty extensively when I get to the Tier 4. I'm going to click on the Tier 4. Remember that 37mm? Oh my goodness. The same gun is what you start with on the Tier 4. It was inadequate at Tier 3. It is a complete joke at Tier 4. In fact, I have so much angst about this gun, I'm talking about it on the Tier 4 tank when I'm doing my review of the Tier 3. And we'll get to that when I do the review of the Tier 4 because holy cow. Anyway, this is pretty easy to get through. Like I said, you can unlock these if you want, but you do not need them to get through to the 14 TP. And I found this to be a very adequate. 37mm was okay. The 47mm made the tank very good, and I'll show you that in the replays. Let's talk 3D model. You can see I've got it called up here, the 10 TP. This is on the Armor Inspector, and the website is Watt Inspector, the webspate. Just got this mouth today. Just trying to learn how to use it. Armor Inspector on wattinspector.com, and you'll see that I've got, you can click on the armor right there and it shows it yellow, and it has thickness of 20mm, and this section is 16. So the gun it is showing it going against is its own gun, the 47mm. So you see you got a decent chance of pinning that thing. Obviously this area right here, the mantlet is very thick and it's spaced. You can see where it says spaced right there. That's important. Do not shoot mantlets in general. That's a bad idea. The turret armor is not very thick at 16, but it is curved, so you do have to watch out for that. You need to flat plate that a little bit. And then the side is interestingly 20mm as well. So this will side scrape okay against the pin that you're dealing with at Tier 2 and 3. Against the 4s, not so much. It doesn't do that great, but it can still bounce depending on what the pin is. The guns are wildly different from Tier 1 to 4 as far as the pin and the damage. There's the derps, there's the little auto cannons, the machine guns, and then there's just the regular kind of 47mm cannons. So you just have to kind of pay attention to what it is that you are facing. But in general, the armor profile is okay. You're not going to rely on it. It will get you some bounces against some of the same tier and lower tier stuff, but not very many. Pretty much just like Tier 1 at Tier 3. Nearly everything that shoots you and hits you squarely is probably going to go through. And you've also got to start watching out for the derp guns that show up, which can really hurt you around Tier 3. It's more of a problem at Tier 4. We'll talk about that when we get there, but at Tier 3, there are a few tanks running around with decent derp guns that can give you a very hard time at Tier 3. So nothing much else to talk about on the armor. It is quite long, so you will find yourself sticking out from behind buildings and little pieces of rubble if you're not careful with that kind of long tank. The turret is well forward, which is going to make poking forward a little bit easier and side scraping backwards a little bit harder because so much of your rear end is going to be sticking out right there. All right, let's move on. All right, let's do a quick comparison between the 10 TP and a couple 3 actually, Math in Public is hard, of the Tech Tree tanks, and then 2 of the premium tanks at Tier 3. We've got the 10 TP, the MX known for its armor, the LTZ-38, and the Sturv M40L, a couple of the newer Tier 3s that have been kicked out in the game. And then the steel clubbing T127 and the free, I think it was free, it was an award tank or something like that, T29. So we look at the firepower. We got an average damage per shot of 75, which is high. Not as high as the derp kind of T29, but still up there. Penetration is sort of low at 56. Not AMX-38 bad, which is known for a terrible gun, but not far off, actually. You got the LTZ at 82 and the Sturv at 78. This tank will, at times, struggle, and this is the top gun. We'll talk a little bit more about the bottom and top gun, like I mentioned earlier, later on in the video. But even with the top gun sitting at 56. Now, that is enough to get through most armor, as you'll see when we take a look at the armor profiles down here, but some of that more higher armored stuff or some of the 4s it faces, it does struggle even with the big gun. Rate of fire is relatively low. That's the trade-off between the average higher-ish average damage per shot. You can see the rest of them fire quite a bit faster other than the derpy T29. Reload time is high. Not quite as bad as the T29, but not far off right there. And traverse speed is enough to get it turned around and get shooting at people. Gun depression is nice and comfortable at -12. Should be able to use any terrain that you run into. Taking a look at the aim time, that's relatively low, kind of in the middle, not too bad, but the dispersion's best as far as these particular tanks go at 0.38, which is still pretty bad, but not terrible. It's actually got a decent accuracy, and you will find yourself fighting close in a lot with tier 3, so the accuracy doesn't hurt too much. For sniping shots, yeah, it's painful. It's painful. Hit points at 230, which is right in the middle right there. The armor, let's talk about this for a moment. It's running 20-20-20. Remember, on the model that we looked at, there were some 16 spots, places where it was only 16. So it's really not going to stop any of those guns you see up above there, unless there's some kind of angle or the gun doesn't quite hit square onto the armor that it's hitting. So you may get a bounce. But notice the AMX-38 at 60-40-40. That's well known as a armored tank. So that's a slow, really armored tank with a terrible gun. And you have, we'll get to it in a minute, it's actually relatively fast. A relatively fast, decent gun as far as alpha goes, but no armor tank on the 10 TP as far as the balance goes right there. T127 at 40-30-30. It's got good angles. That's what it's got going for it. There's the mobility I talked about, 50 kilometers an hour and 20 backwards. Top as far as these particular tanks go right there. Specific power is pretty decent in there as well. And the traverse on the entire chassis is actually relatively high, so it will spin around. Although it is a long tank, so that does affect some of the spinning about. Interesting that the concealment, moving, and stationary is exactly the same. I wasn't sure that light tanks carried that capability down at this level, but it appears that they do. That's gone slightly beyond my knowledge base, to be quite honest, on the game. But the important part is they are the same. Look at them, exactly the same. And they're pretty high, so decently concealable kind of tank. View range at 310. Somehow the Swedes have the most amazing view range at tier 3. That's very strange, but there it is. And the signal range, which is something I make quite a bit of fun of a lot because it gets saturated at the higher tiers where I do most of my reviews. This actually has some effect at tier 3, 365. Having a pretty good radio in the tank is not a bad thing, actually. And that is pretty much the comparison. So what is this overall as we look at this? It's got a decently punchy gun with some subpar penetration. So it will struggle occasionally with the pen, but it does hit decently hard at this tier. It's quite mobile, but its rate of fire is pretty low and its DPM is trash. There you go. Let's move on. All right, we're going to talk about my stats. This is always fun, and it's going to be a little bit off. First of all, it's a low sample size at 9, and I ran a whole 44%. Win rate with 406 average XP. I'll get to what I set this thing up with in just a moment, but I didn't carry any equipment or have a good crew. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So some of that affected what happened. A 1.11 damage ratio, just barely did more damage than I took. Just barely destroyed more tanks than the times I got destroyed. You can see the armor use is right down where you'd expect it with such a lightly armored tank. Simply did not do that good with the armor. You'll notice that the hit rate is actually in the ballpark. You should be between 70 and 80. So even with a 70% hit rate, I didn't do a whole bunch of damage, because if you look at the damage caused, 218 average and received 196. That's how you get a 1.11 damage ratio. You barely do more than you take, which is not very good. 77 assist. Spotted 1.67. That's actually relatively high, so I did play aggressively. The point was to get through this tank. I got up, I got my shots, and moved on from there. So if you're a little bit more careful, we'll talk about that somewhat in the replay review. If you're a little bit more careful, then you're going to do better than these stats for sure. My best game was 911 experience, and I did 519 damage once with 3 kills. So that's the stats on that tank. Let's move on to my setup, and I'll explain some of the reason for those stats. So here's my setup for this beast, running around in the 10 TP with no equipment. I simply just did not put any on it. I wanted to get through it. I talked about how I didn't put any tracks or anything else. All I did was go through the gun. It was a much different tank with that 47mm gun. Here's the two guns. 47mm. Per the comparison, 75 average damage, 56 pen. When you're running the 37 at tier 3 with 34 pen and 40 damage, you're not getting very far. It was barely adequate at tier 3. I was glad to get rid of it. Just wait till you get to tier 4. More to come on that. I'm still scarred from running the 37mm at tier 4. Let me just mention, devs, I cannot for the life of me understand why you did that. And I'm gonna wear you out on the next one on the tier 4 because of that. The new player experience. Holy cow. Okay. I ran no gold. I run with 108 AP. I didn't even bring any HE. I did put kits. So that my only My only non-Iron Man kind of thing is I did run kits with a large fire extinguisher. I've mentioned it before, I just hate lighting on fire, so I always carry one of those, and I have a bunch of free ones sitting in my garage anyway, so there's no reason not to put that thing on. And you'll see the crew, they got a little bit of training in, and when I moved on to the Tier 4, they stayed. I bought a new crew in the Tier 4. Just no sense spending the money retraining crews that you only played 9 times the tier down below. And that is pretty much the setup. Like I said, I never got the tracks, I didn't get the engine, and I didn't get the radio. Some of those things will improve your gameplay. If you put on a rammer and the rest of the stuff, that will improve your gameplay. You put on some camo, that will help your camo. So if you really dude this thing up, obviously it'll be as good as a 10 TP can be. And I would say it's a solidly in the middle kind of Tier 3 tank. All right, that is my setup. Let's move on to the examples. All right, after that collage of the futility of the 37 millimeter, once you get the 47 millimeter, it actually makes the tank capable. I wouldn't say it necessarily competent. It's still kind of a crummy tank, but 47 millimeter will pen things. So you can see here we're coming up over the hill. Where are we? Westfield. And of course, farming a AFK tank is always helpful for the damage. But the point is, it's actually penning this thing no problem. It is the side armor, but we'll get another face shot here. I'll show you. Coming up here, shooting into the 14 TP, something it absolutely struggled with the 37 millimeter, the front armor of it, and just going right through it, no problem. Down that guy goes. It will still bounce on occasion. You can see that it's got good gun depression, so it can fight on the hill right there pretty easily. Decent mobility. One thing you will find with most of these tanks, especially the 3 and the 4, a little bit on the 5 itself, is the track traverse. While the number is decent, it's so long it has a really hard time turning. So it's okay in a straight line, but it is not very nimble going around buildings or around corners, circling, that kind of thing. A little bounce right there that it can't penetrate. It does still tend to bounce a little bit. The pen is not that high. And you can see the dispersion's massive, especially while moving. You see the circle is, what, 3 or 4 times as big as the target there. And I managed 366, which is not very much damage, but if you remember what my average was, that's okay. And on the 37 millimeter, which I didn't show the end of any of those, the damage was even worse than that. So it is really difficult, unless you get in a very good situation of being able to farm people, to get any kind of damage out of this gun between the dispersion, the lack of pen overall. Very difficult. Let's move on to the next one. All right, for the second example, here I am top tier. Only 2-tier battle, 3s and 2s right here on Himmelsdorf. Come from the south spawn, moving up to the top. And we're going to talk just a little bit here about the nature of this tier of battle plus this gun, which most of the tanks at this tier have this kind of problem. You want to stand off because you can get shredded so easily, but the guns are so inaccurate it can be very difficult. So the guns sort of dictate that you need to get forward. Let's see how this works out. These are much shorter range engagements going on right here. You remember on the last one I got onto that hill and I was close enough to get some decently aimed shots, and I had a couple moments to zoom in. So I'm able to do that on that 7 TP, and that's a tier 2 tank, which I'm going to have a pretty good time with the 47 millimeter. He ends up missing right there. But you can see how big the dispersion is when you move, kind of creeping up, waiting for that guy to pop over. Now I'm zooming in, and we'll move forward. Because it looks like we only got this T48 thing over here. 46, whatever it is, and the 7 TP. Otherwise, there's a cruiser now, so at least one more guy's come up here. Most of the tanks at this tier are fast enough that once you get up there and sit there for a while, if nothing else shows up, there's probably nothing else coming. He's just sort of standing in. There's that actually didn't quite get there. My friend whittles him down a little bit enough that I can get a one shot off of him. And we've cleared the top. So move forward. There was a 7 TP there, so I'm going to come forward. I'm going to look for him. I'm going to use this dead tank as a little bit of extra armor. See if I can spot him. There he is. So just come just around the corner of this thing. There's that accuracy letting me down, so I'm thinking I'll just go ahead and let this zoom in completely. I should have moved. Got a little lazy and just counted on the fact that he's moving and his dispersion is terrible, but naturally the shot goes right into me. That second shot would have also hit me, but it ended up hitting the tank in front of me first. Come down around the corner, and this is an interesting little series right here. I'm going to get a very heavily armored H-35. When I came down here, I knew that was going to be a problem. So I simply wasn't going to pen him in the front. I needed to get to that little turret there, potentially the lower plate, which I didn't investigate. So he's just moving forward. It doesn't have a really great gun on the H-35, but it's got a ton of armor. Now I can move around him, but I also know there's an M2 medium lurking around somewhere else, which we'll find here in just a moment. So we'll put another shot at him. Looking to get to the turret, but I can't quite get it. There's the M2, who's showing mostly mantlet. That's going to be problematic. Again, that gun's going to have a hard time going through that without gold. Had I been able to press 2 right there, probably would have had 2 shots of damage in, maybe 3. But of course I'm not carrying it, as I was running Iron Man. So now I have to go ahead and try to pick at the little weak spot of the turret, or not the turret, but the cupola up there, and I'm able to hit the hatch. Cupola, that one doesn't go in, but I'm kind of moving when I do it. And he sits there for some reason, allows me to shoot it right in there, and at that range, fairly decent likelihood of getting in. Messing around here trying to get a shot on it, and there we go. Put that guy down. Now this is interesting here. I'm going to come out here and take a shot and eat a shot, and we both are reloading. I'm about here to take a shot. I'm thinking I'm going to surely reload faster than the derp gun, but no, I do not reload faster than the derp gun, or if I do, it's not by much. You see that my shot indicator went to green, and I hesitated for just a half a second to try to fix the aim, but I figured I had plenty of time with a derp gun. But that little M2 reloads that thing pretty quickly, and down I go at a whole 456. Probably about the best game I had in this tank, to be quite honest, in the 9 or so battles that I had in it. So there's just a couple examples. The 37mm being just miserable, the 47mm making the tank capable of playing, but still struggling against the tier 4s. That's it for the, what am I driving? This silly thing, the 10 TP review.